If you're like me and you're studying the Japanese language, it is also helpful to learn about Japanese culture. Some linguists, like Sandra Patricia Mercuri, argue that language and culture are indivisible. In her writings on cultural and social capital, Mercuri states that language is deeply rooted in culture and indivisible from identity, a topic featured in UNESCO's 2023 children's book, What Makes Us Human. While I am currently unable to become fully immersed in Japanese language podcasts, I spend a lot of time listening to English language podcasts that are related to Japan or learning Japanese. I've curated 5 of my favorite Japan-related podcasts and encourage you to try listening to them if you want extra motivation or just good entertainment. Here they are, in no particular order, my top 5 Japan-related podcasts. First up, we have Mangasplaining. This is a wonderfully designed podcast where 3 of the hosts are quite familiar with manga and 1 is a newcomer. After assigning readings in a book club format, the hosts discuss various manga volumes and speak about comics as a medium. Here is the official description from the Mangasplaining website's FAQ page. Mangasplaining is a collaborative, multi-pronged project, first expressed as a weekly podcast and conceived by comic workers and friends Deb Aoki, David Brothers, Christopher Butcher, and Chip Zdarsky. It emerged from their appreciation of Japanese manga culture and the realization that some people, Chip mostly, were avid comic readers but didn't know how to start reading manga. This is not as uncommon as you might think. Though the Anglosphere boasts millions of manga fans, mainstream manga publishing caters mostly to teen readers, and it can be difficult to know where to start if you're outside of that demographic. Thus, the Mangasplaining podcast was born. The podcast is a great way to discover classics, exciting new works, and to get a broad overview of manga in all its varieties. If you don't know a lot about manga, you can relate to Chip as he discovers the style, tropes, and history of Japanese comics. All of the hosts are very knowledgeable about comics, as well as their creation and marketing. The hosts are casual and quick-witted, but depending on the manga in question, the topics can become quite thoughtful and emotional. Mangasplaining is a great way to get new manga recommendations. The detailed show notes provide links and information that allows you to dive deeper into the world of manga. I have gone on to happily read manga volumes suggested by this podcast, including Dandadan or Witch Hat Atelier. Even the consistent but passing reference to Hajime no Ippo piqued my curiosity enough to check it out. As an avid manga reader, I especially look forward to hearing what Chip has to say when the podcast covers one of my favorite series. I was sweating as they approached reading Phoenix by Azuma Tezuka or Nazca Valley of the Wind. He is always honest in critique, and his knowledge of Western comics adds a welcome contrast. Hearing the host rationale as they suggest what to read next is especially fun, and the format allows for the hosts to take turns defending their picks. While the discussion is centered around comics and manga, the hosts occasionally discuss Japan, Japanese language, and the Japanese comic market. Finally, Mangasplaining Extra, or MSX, is an email newsletter, which has gone on to publish manga of its own. It's wonderful to see this project grow and expand, and is always an entertaining and thought-provoking discussion. Longtime fans of manga or new readers will both enjoy listening to this podcast. Next, we have The Krewe of Japan. The Krewe of Japan is a podcast originating from the Japan Society of New Orleans. Many of the hosts are former JETs, English teachers who taught in Japan. The crew discusses their experiences living in Japan, learning Japanese, as well as their favorite aspects of Japanese culture. Here is the official podcast description from the Japan Society of New Orleans website. Welcome to the Krewe of Japan podcast, where our team of hosts will take you on weekly journeys through Japanese culture. From pop culture and food, to Japanese art, to Japan's links to New Orleans, we will cover it all. With the help of guest experts, Japanese natives, expats, and more, we'll make understanding Japan and its culture easier than ever before. We are so excited to be able to continue engaging and learning about Japan with you in a new way. Krewe of Japan hosts impressive guests from Dogen to James Heisig, Matt Alt, and E.G. Uchida. The range of guests and specialized topics provide an ever-increasing wealth of knowledge, delivered in a cheerful and enthusiastic manner. The podcast works equally well when there is no guest, when the hosts cover topics such as anime, konbinis, or the seasons and weather of Japan. The hosts are passionate and care deeply about the topics they present. It's nice to hear about the crew's journey when I need extra motivation for my own. The New Orleans connection to figures like Lafcadio Hearn and the rich culture of music, art, and food makes for interesting parallels to Japan. New Orleans even has a sister city in Japan, Matsui, which is often mentioned. I find myself listening to this podcast frequently as it provides a warm feeling and rich facts. The topics of the podcast episodes are varied, so there is a little something for everyone. Next up, we have Translation Chat. Translation Chat is a podcast created by Jennifer O'Donnell. It is focused on Japanese media and the translation or localization choices made when bringing that media to an English-speaking audience. Because of this focus, it might be one of the more beneficial resources on this list for language learners. The podcast provides insights into the translation industry of manga, anime, and video games. There is a nice range of media mentioned, from Final Fantasy VII to Black Cat, or All You Need Is Kill. Here is the official description from the Translation Chat website. Translation Chat is a podcast on Japanese to English media translation where your host, Jennifer O'Donnell, chats with translators and editors in the Japanese to English localization industry about their favorite translations of Japanese media. A little further down the page, O'Donnell discusses some of their rationale behind creating the podcast. As a nerd fighter who aims to decrease world suck, I wanted to create positive discussions about translations. In this series, I interview people who work in the Japanese to English media localization industry about their favorite translations by other people. We discuss why the translations are so good and how the translation has impacted their own work and views on translation. Decreasing world suck certainly seems like an admirable hobby. The podcast undeniably has had an impact on how I view and recognize translations. It's nice to hear the choices and thoughts of those working in the field. Understanding approaches to translation is valuable as a language learner and a consumer of diverse media. I've learned that localization can sometimes be a hot topic, and that there are those who argue for the nebulous concept of a true translation. Translation Chat also discusses a lot of my favorite video games, featuring Final Fantasy Tactics, Ace Attorney, or Silent Hill. It's nice to see video games inevitably becoming part of the conversation when it comes to media and culture. Discussions of these games, alongside learning the odd phrase in Japanese, can be a helpful break from studying a textbook. Read Japanese Literature, or RJL, is a podcast by Allison Fincher. The podcast is centered around deep conversations about various aspects of Japanese literature. The podcast features themes such as language use, translation, representation, and Japanese folktales. Fincher discusses specific authors as well as history and literature trends. RJL boasts an impressive range of topics and does a great job using a modern lens to discuss historical themes. The approach is engaging and makes me immediately interested or invested when listening. Just by looking at the carefully curated selection of topics, you can tell how strong a podcast this is. There are episodes emphasizing female writers, discussions of high and low art, and analysis of asexuality in Japanese media. I personally enjoyed the episodes on Japanese science fiction and magical realism. The episodes about translating Japanese to English might be especially valuable for language learners. Here is the description from the RJL website. Read Japanese Literature is a resource for people who want to read and enjoy Japanese fiction in an English translation. The podcast is a way to learn about the history of Japanese literature and some of its best works. Our list of Japanese fiction in an English translation is an index of titles that have been or are currently available in English. You can also find reading lists, reviews, and other information about Japanese books and authors. If you're interested in literature or Japan, then this is the podcast for you. Finally, we have Tofugu. From the creators of Wanikani and the Crabigator behind Tofugu.com comes the Tofugu Podcast. The podcast features a focus on Japanese learning strategies, tips, and tricks. In theory, this podcast should be directly helpful for Japanese learners. There are episodes with advice for new learners and specific discussions of the quirks of Japanese language, like particles, pronouns, honorifics, and verbs. There are also some cultural episodes such as How to Lead a Group of Friends Around Japan, or Japanese Ghosts and Monsters. It is interesting to hear from the Tofugu staff, who are very knowledgeable about Japanese language. Many are responsible for writing the helpful and informative articles that the website is known for, or creating the mnemonic charts that I myself use to learn hiragana and katakana. You get to hear success stories and adventures from dedicated language learners who work hard to help others. Like many things when it comes to Tofugu, the podcast and hosts have a good sense of humor and help to present the information in a fun and dynamic way. Here is part of the podcast description from the Tofugu website. The Tofugu Podcast doesn't teach you Japanese, but it will tell you how to study more effectively. The Tofugu staff and their guests know their stuff when it comes to the weird, off-the-beaten track, sightseeing spots, restaurants, and shops. If you want to know about the most popular and well-documented tourist attractions in Japan, you should listen to another podcast. The whole description page is written like a choose-your-own-adventure novel, which gives you a sense of what you're in for if you listen to this podcast. I highly recommend Tofugu and all their ventures. As I mentioned in my last top 5 video, Wanikani is especially helpful when learning kanji. All these podcasts are well produced, and the interviewers ask excellent questions when they have guests. They are also well edited. I especially enjoy the creative censorship of Mangasplaining. They cover swears by reversing audio or by including shoujo sparkling sounds. I'm also a fan of the Wanikani advertisements in the Tofugu podcast, which are always tongue-in-cheek and enjoyable. I hope these podcasts help you on your learning journey. They are great for language learners who need extra motivation, anyone planning a trip to Japan, or those of us who just love Japanese culture. If there is a Japan-related podcast you enjoy that I haven't mentioned, please let me know in a comment below. Hopefully one day I can make a similar list of podcasts entirely in Japanese. Until that time comes, I will continue to immerse myself in Japanese culture in the hopes that it helps me learn Japanese. I look forward to each new season and episode of these podcasts, and I'm thankful to the hosts for their hard work. The more I learn about languages and translation, the more I feel like the world is opening up to me. That's all for now. Thanks for listening, and take care.